Many of you know that our Testimony HQ folks have worked especially hard to learn how to talk about their faith in their community, church, and beyond. And Kelly Raaum will now continue in our series of testimonies this morning as she shares her story about faith in a difficult circumstance.
Good morning. My name is Kelly Raaum. I have been a member of Grace since 1993. I was married here, and my children were raised here, but I spent my whole growing up years moving all around the country. But I have been a follower of Christ since I was sometime in elementary school. I was raised in the church wherever we lived. That was an important part of my family. So I have heard and seen faith lived out in many different expressions. This summer, we have heard, as you mentioned, lots of powerful testimonies given by members of our congregation. And if I'm being honest, sometimes when I compare mine to some that we've heard, mine can feel a little bit underwhelming. I don't have a conversion story. I don't have a prison story like this morning. Well, almost, but that's a whole nother story. I don't have a miracle story or a life or death story or a story that we learned about Sybil last week about a rescue on the water. I don't have any of those stories. But what I do have is a testimony to God's activity in my life during some difficult circumstances for me. As far back as I can remember, I had always been in love with the country of Ireland, and I had always wanted to go. Well, as a single young school teacher, it took me a long time to save up enough money to go, and I finally did. And in the summer of 1991, a coworker and I flew to Ireland for my dream trip to the Emerald Isle. Now, I had read and researched and planned for an entire year. My route was determined down to the very last detail. The bed and breakfast were reserved, the rental car was secured, the itinerary was all mapped out, the plane tickets were purchased. We flew into London, spent a few days sightseeing, took the train across Wales, then the ferry across to Dublin, stayed there for a few days in the city, and then our adventure really began. We traveled around the countryside, stopping at every castle, every cemetery, every ruin that was on my list. The land was stunning, and I was on cloud nine. About halfway through the trip, we made it to the west coast of Ireland to stay for a few days in the city of Galway. And on our first full day there, we drove outside the city to explore more of the remote countryside. We pulled off the road anytime something of interest caught our eye, right? Well, after one such side trip, I pulled back up to the main road, looked for cars either direction, as you do, and then I proceeded out onto the road, only to be hit by someone, T-boned, as they say, coming up these Irish country back roads, going way too fast, I might add. Not me, he was driving way too fast. Well, when the car finally came to a stop, we did manage to climb out the passenger side. I was the driver. And I couldn't open my door because the door was about halfway in my seat, so I couldn't get out. So we climbed out. The wind knocked out of me, a cut on my leg, but otherwise, okay. I don't know how long it took for the Irish Garda, the police, to arrive, nor do I know who contacted them. What I do remember was their reaction to two young American women. Once they determined no one needed an ambulance and we had insurance, they packed up and they left. But we were stranded there. Can you imagine my prayers that began, asking God for help? What on earth were we going to do? Had no clue. By the way, I was in my mid-20s. I had no idea how to do anything. Some kind of stranger, don't know who it was, don't know where he came from, but some kind stranger offered us a ride into the nearby town and dropped us off at a payphone, which also I had no idea how to use a payphone in Ireland either. The rental car company sent the tow truck, We hitched a ride back into town with him, and would you believe they just handed us over a new set of keys and a new car. That evening we walked into Galway, didn't want to get behind the car again, behind the wheel, but we walked into town and had McDonald's for dinner, and it was so comforting. I was looking back in preparing this story, I was looking back at my travel record, my diary for my days, and this is all it said for that day. Had a wreck, totaled a car, got some bruises, the guardo was a jerk. Everyone else was wonderful. Got a new car, ate at McDonald's, picked some shells. Tomorrow has to be better. We'll see. Well, one of the highlights of my trip was our day spent on the Aran Islands, 3 rocky isles that guard the mouth of Galway Bay. And this was our only group activity. Everything else was done just by ourselves. So we had to board a bus in the city, take a long bus ride out to the coast, take a long ferry ride out to the islands. Well, the day was wonderful. We spent it exploring. It was fantastic. Late in the afternoon, we made our way back down to the dock for the ferry ride back. Only we didn't have a real firm grasp of the departure time. So we thought the ferry left at 5. It had already left at 4:30. 2 young women who don't speak Gaelic are stranded yet again on the pier. We had just missed the proverbial last boat off the island. We had no cell phones, no one was around. We were a complete mess. Had no idea what to do, and again, I prayed. How in the world were we going to get out of this? Well, at some point, we were approached by a fisherman who was loading up all of his equipment at the end of his long workday. We explained our predicament, and he kindly offered to let us ride on his fishing boat back to the mainland. We were rescued. It was fantastic. God answered my prayers. Throughout the hour-long boat ride, I could feel my blood pressure beginning to return to normal. Everything would be okay. Back on the island, on the mainland, we had another realization. The bus had left us too. So there we were, stranded yet again. The fishing boat captain saw us again, realized what had happened, and said he could offer us a ride back into town with him and one of his crew. So during another awkward ride, I had 2 thoughts that ran through my head. Number 1, if it weren't for the kindness of strangers, where would I be? I was completely at their mercy. And number 2, what were you thinking? You've gotten in a car with 2 men you do not know. They could be axe murderers, all of these things that run through your mind. I thought, I'll never see my family again. That's it. They're going to look for me in Ireland. Well, because of my upbringing, I had been taught to pray in all circumstances. So clearly that's what I had been doing, really for the past 2 days, praying. But at this point, that is all I could do. I didn't know what specifically to pray for. I just begged God for help. And he did, in unexpected ways, but he did. We arrived in Galway, unharmed, grateful, and exhausted. And those experiences in Ireland had a profound impact on my life, and I still reflect on them quite often, actually. Is God active in my life? Yes. This is what I know. God heard my cries for help many times. God protected me from danger. God provided a way out. He rescued me. And God did give me a story to share. It's not a conversion story, a rags to riches story, one that involves death or prison or a water rescue, but it's mine. A story of God's faithfulness and help in times of trouble. And over the last decades, since this trip, I've had a number of verses, but 4 in particular that are those often visited passages in your Bible that have highlights and underlines and dog-eared pages. Whenever I find myself in crisis and I really need God to come through, I need something, these are my go-to passages. Psalm 8:6. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I cried for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. Psalm 28:6. Blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the sound of my pleadings. Psalm 46:1, that we all can sing. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And Psalm 55:17. Evening and morning and at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he will hear my voice. Can you sense a theme? The theme for me. I pray these verses as much to remind God of his promise to me as I do to remind myself. Sometimes he protects me. Sometimes he rescues me. Sometimes he sends kind strangers. Sometimes he leaves me right where I am in the midst of my difficult circumstance, sometimes of my own making. But he always hears my cry, and sometimes that is enough. Thank you.